Let's get to Dr. Scott Gottlieb for a reaction to that interview. He's the former FDA commissioner, a CNBC contributor. He serves on the boards of Illumina and Pfizer. Were you able to hear the entire, all of Mr. O'Day's comments, Scott?
Most of it.
Most of it? Okay. You have a top three things that you were struck with in listening?
Well, look, this is an important advance. We've said all along this drug's not a home run, but it's probably going to be beneficial for a certain cohort of patients with COVID-19. I think one of the headlines coming out of the company's statements in recent days in that interview is that they're going to have more supply than what we initially thought. They've been able to compress the time it takes to manufacture this drug. This is a very complex drug to manufacture, and it seems that they've cut the time it takes to manufacture this drug almost in half from what it was originally. So they'll be able to stretch their supply chain. They also may be able to get approval eventually for a 5-day course rather than a 10-day course. If you look at the data coming out of that open label study they did, which really showed no measurable difference between 5 or 10 days. If they're able to dose this over 5 days rather than 10, which was the NIAID study, the NIH study looked at 10 days, but if they're able to get it down to 5 days, that's going to effectively double the amount of supply. So heading into the fall, when we're likely to have outbreaks, you're going to want to be able to stretch the supply of this drug. Remember, this drug can be used for treatment, but I suspect we're also going to start to look at using it potentially for prophylaxis for patients who are exposed to COVID-19, maybe in a limited duration, maybe a dose or two. It might help prevent the onset of symptoms, prevent people from actually contracting the virus. And so we're going to start to look to use this potentially in different ways if it makes it to the market, and I think it will in very short order.
Damn, it'd be nice to have the inhaler, Scott, instead of, for a couple of doses to need the IV, right?
The nebulizer.
Yeah, nebulizer, sorry.
Yeah, look, it's right. Yeah, look, it's not an optimal drug by any means. I don't think that you're going to be able to formulate this into an oral formulation, so it's an intravenous drug right now. It needs to be delivered in the hospital. But that's not that much of an impediment, because in most cases you're going to be using this drug in patients who have more advanced COVID-19 or patients who are higher risk of a bad outcome, and those patients generally are going to be hospitalized. We're a long way from sort of having a Tamiflu for COVID-19, where you just have an outpatient drug that's perceived as very safe and could be taken both as a prophylaxis for people who are exposed to it as well as an early treatment. But we don't necessarily need that for the fall. I think if you can couple Remdesivir with 1 or 2 other drugs, which we may have, it's going to change the risk profile of this infection.
Hey, we're going to get back. Becky wants to get back to talking about Remdesivir, obviously. I just want to quickly bring up this FT article today, Scott, where in China, 3/5 of the new coronavirus cases in China show no symptoms. So 60% asymptomatic. Now, I've gone back and forth with Sam Waxel about whether that means that the virus is mutating to a less virulent form, or whether all along it was 60% and there wasn't enough testing to know that.
Yeah, it looks like there's a high percentage of patients who are asymptomatic. 60 is the high end of the different ranges that we've seen. But if you look at the French aircraft carrier where it became epidemic on that ship, that was about, if I remember correctly, around 50%. There was a very good study done in northern Italy looking at a town, and they found about 40% of the spread was asymptomatic. The Diamond Princess, if I recall correctly, was about 30%. So there's studies that have looked at the percentage of asymptomatic spread where you've had populations in sort of confined settings, and you've been able to see how much of the infection is asymptomatic versus symptomatic spread because you had an epidemic in an enclosed space. It ranged anywhere from about 20% to about 55% on the high end. So there's been some studies. There's been probably a dozen good studies of this right now. So that's within the range. It's a little high, but it's within the range. We're probably diagnosing 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 infections. There's probably about, I would say, at least a third of the infections are asymptomatic. We should work on those assumptions when we do our modeling.
Becky.
Hey, Dr. Gottlieb, back to Remdesivir very quickly. When we had the CEO on, I asked him twice, keeping in mind the op-ed that you had written earlier this week about how we really need to make sure that we have manufacturing for some of these things happening in the United States to make sure that our population can get access to it. Asked him twice about whether he's been pressured by any country, either in the manufacturing areas or along the supply chain, who has said to him, you're going to take care of our population first. He didn't really answer the question, which to me sounded like a yes. But what do you think? You think the country that might be pressuring him rhymes with Blima? or Blamerica?
Well, I think that they have a complex manufacturing supply chain right now that probably takes certain components of this outside the U.S. They don't have an entirely U.S. supply chain. And so long as they're dependent upon other countries for starting ingredients to that drug, and most companies are. Most companies have starting ingredients to their drugs that come from other countries, including China. They're going to have to make sure that they supply those markets. Look, I think that there's going to be enough doses heading into the fall unless we have a major epidemic. But if we have something on a proportion of outbreaks, large outbreaks in American cities, or even something approximating what we've just gone through, I think we're going to have the hundreds of thousands of doses that we would need, getting close to the millions of doses. Initially, they were talking about having potentially 1 million doses by the end of the year. Now they're talking about having multiples of millions of doses by the end of the year, because they've been able to compress that supply chain, I suspect, in the manufacturing cycle. And if you can get it down to 5 days rather than 10, which I think you can, that's going to stretch their supply chain even further. So I think that it's going to be there. The other thing you're going to see is other companies step in to start helping them manufacture this. I think that Gilead's going to get assistance from other biopharmaceutical companies to look at different components of how to manufacture this, both domestically and abroad.
Hey, Dr. Gottlieb, I wanted to ask you about something completely different, which is a report that I think came out yesterday that in Switzerland, Swiss officials are now telling people that young children under the age of 10 can and should or are able to hug their grandparents. What did you make of this report? Did you see this?
I didn't see that particular report. There was a study that came out about 2 or 3 days ago that seemed to suggest that children both aren't getting infected and aren't passing on the virus. It was one study. There were some limitations to it. There were other studies that showed the opposite. So I think this is very inconclusive. I have a hard time believing, in the absence of really objective data, that their kids aren't vectors for this, that they're not getting infected at all. I happen to believe that they're getting infected. They're just getting subclinical infection for a variety of reasons, some of which we don't fully understand. That could be because I have 3 young kids who constantly get me sick, so I'm biased in my analysis. But I believe that the kids are vectors here. And until you have really objective evidence proving that they're not, and it's going to take studies where you're actually evaluating children and swabbing them at a large scale to see if it's circulating among kids, and those are going to be hard to do. But until we have that kind of really objective data, I think we should work on the assumption that the kids are probably vectors for the virus. They're probably getting colonized with it. And we've seen recently some kids getting sick. We've seen kids having some autoimmune type of reactions from COVID-19, some unusual types of illness. So we know kids can get sick from this, just at a much, much smaller proportion than what we're seeing in adults.
Hey, Scott, do you have an opinion on the way to approach a vaccine? And have you looked into the different platforms enough of, let's say, Oxford University versus Pfizer versus Moderna? Have you looked into the platforms enough to have formed an opinion on which technique is going to bear the most fruit and easiest to manufacture and quickest to prove efficacy? Do you know?
Well, I don't think anyone knows right now. So Oxford is a similar platform to what J&J is doing, using an adenoviral vector vaccine. There's a couple of companies, including Pfizer, doing mRNA approaches. There's some companies using more traditional approaches, like Sanofi, where they're using their flu block, the traditional approach to flu vaccine manufacturing. So it's a protein-based vaccine. Merck seems to be doing something perhaps off of the Ebola platform that they have. There's some DNA vaccines in development. So there's multiple platforms in development. I think what's going to end up happening is probably more than one is going to make it over the finish line. You're going to have some heterogeneity and some variety in the market. And different vaccines will have different attributes that might make them better for certain situations. But ultimately, we need more than one manufacturer to be successful. If we only have one manufacturer coming to market with a vaccine, we're going to be severely supply constrained. And so we need more than one major manufacturer to be successful here and come to the market. And I like the fact that there's multiple approaches underway. It gives us multiple shots on goal. We don't know what's going to be the most effective vaccine, what's going to provide the most immunity. So having all of these approaches underway, I think, is very good for development and very good for sharing risk.